Hi everyone. We will continue our study on plants in this chapter. Last chapter, we talked about the evolutionary process of how plants have started life on land from water, which was also a divergent of algae, as we have talked about. We have also discussed the adaptations plants needed to have in order to survive, thrive, and also reproduce on land. Then we started talking about each group of plants according to their order of appearance that has been hypothesized by the paleobotanists, which are really people that study plant fossils, and formulated the phylogeny of plants. And here it is again. We started by discussing the group of non-vascular plants, known as bryophytes, which included three phyla of plants, the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. Make sure you remember the details about the moss life cycle as well. And so we ended chapter 29 with our study of seedless vascular plants, which included two phyla of plants, the lycophytes, and the monilophytes. Lycophytes included club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts, whereas your monilophytes included the ferns, horsetail, and whisk ferns. So make sure you remember the details about the fern life cycle as well, because in this chapter, we will have two more groups of plants to study and also two more life cycle to study. So in a sense, for lecture exam 2, you will have four groups of plants and four different life cycles to remember. And there are little details that are different between those four things. So I can imagine it can get confusing when all of them appear on lecture exam 2. So make sure you're clear about which thing or which trait, which part of the cycle belongs with which plant group. And so in this chapter, we will finish up the rest of the phylogenetic tree by talking about seed plants, which include gymnosperms and also angiosperm. We kind of introduced what those are in the last chapter. So this chapter will dive deep into it. So let's get started. So just as we have talked about the adaptation of the first plants for life on land, we will talk about adaptations that have enabled seed plants to make up the majority of plant biodiversity we have today. Approximately 90% of all plant species in this entire world are angiosperm. And angiosperms actually falls under the category of seed plants, like we just mentioned. But what are seeds, though? Well, seeds actually consist of an embryo, believe it or not. They call it an embryo, and food supply surrounded by protective coats. Again, the embryo, goes back to why we call plants embryophytes because of the fact that they do have embryos. And then there's food supply that is going with the embryo so that when the embryo grows to a sporophyte, there are food supply to enrich the embryo for growth. Um, but then again, that is something we'll talk more about when we go deeper into the chapter. And so with the evolution of seeds come with a whole bunch of other adaptations that we will discuss in detail. First, you have what's called the reduced male and female gametophytes, which is they are both developed within your parental sporophytes, and they're protected from environmental stresses such as drought and UV radiation. So the fact that they're reduced, it helps them hide within these structures and be protected by them so that they're not prone to damage. Second, seed plants now have pollens that protect male gametophytes, which are really the ones that make sperm, can be transported by wind and animals because they're so light. And they come sometimes with different shapes and sizes, such that you can actually be carried by animals as well. Third, ovules protect female gametophytes, which ultimately becomes the egg of the plants. And all seed plants are what we call heterosporous. And if we remember, from the last chapter, heterosporous means that you do have two different gametophyte that is being generated. There is no, at the same time or same organ generating both sperm and egg. You have two separate things that generate sperm and egg when we're talking about heterosporous. And lastly, when we talked about an ovule, okay, ovule is fertilized by pollen because we already said ovule is the egg, pollen is the sperm. And when ovule is fertilized by the pollen, it will develop into what's called a seed. And we already defined what a seed is. And this is what ultimately enable reproduction under a much broader range of conditions. Also goes with why angiosperm makes up 90% of all plant species, because of the fact that seed allows for large distance, okay, or long distance of colonization by these plants. So we'll talk about what are all these things are within the embryo itself, okay? All right, so let's start by talking about the seed plant's first adaptation, which is the reduced size of gametophytes. So small that they are now microscopic compared to gametophytes of non-vascular and seedless vascular plants that we talked about in the last chapter. Those were huge because they were visible to the naked eye. And then I showed you pictures of those large gametophytes. Now, in the seed plants, we can't even see them but with our naked eye. You have to look under the microscope. Um, so again, in the last chapter, we said that bryophytes, which includes moss, have life cycle that is dominated by gametophytes. If you remember, gametophytes defined as those that produce gametes, and gametes defined as your sperm cell and your egg cell. And then seedless vascular plants, which were ferns, have life cycle that were dominated by sporophytes, which were organs of the plant that produce spores. Okay, and spores are different from gametes. Now, seed plants, which includes your gymnosperms and angiosperms, have even further gametophyte reduction. Like I said, they have become microscopic. And here's a review of gametophyte and sporophyte differences amongst the three plant groups that we just talked about. So again, reminder so that you can keep it all straight for the exam. Non-vascular plants such as mosses have dominant gametophyte stages in their life cycle. Okay, that's why their gametophytes are humongous like this compared to sporophyte. Sporophyte are usually small and they are dependent on gametophyte for nutrition. As a review, remember that sporophyte up here, these little dots here have little foot that connects with the gametophyte. And we said that they're dependent. They have to be attached for the rest of their lives because of the fact that um, because of the fact that you have to depend, let nutrients come from the gametophyte into the sporophyte. Okay. For the next group of plants, which were seedless vascular plants, includes your ferns and other, mosses, club mosses, etc. They have reduced the size of gametophytes, and they are actually independent from the sporophytes. They don't have to depend on the sporophytes for nutrition. So the gametophyte themselves, which are something that looks like this for ferns, they're very independent. They're photosynthetic themselves, which means they can produce their own food, and they are free living, separate from the sporophytes. And hence the seedless vascular plants, which is ferns, have life cycle that is dominant with the sporophyte stages. Okay, so sporophyte stages are dominant in those life cycle, which is why sporophyte is a lot bigger. And then that's the leafy parts of the plants. And then lastly, which is this chapter where we talk about seed plants, now the gametophytes reduce even further such that they are now microscopic and they always depend on surrounding sporophyte tissue for nutrition. Now, surrounding means that these gametophytes are actually embedded within the sporophyte itself, that they don't need to be dispersed like this or attached like this. Okay, so we look at the trend going across the three groups of plants from most ancient to most recent. I mean, we're talking about ancestor of them, from fossil records. These were the first plants to have evolved, and then on to your seedless vascular plants, and then your seed plants. So for seed plants, the sporophyte stage is dominant, just like your seedless vascular plants. And then the only difference is that gametophyte is so small that you can't even see them with your naked eye. And then your gymnosperms, you have usually kind of leafy trees or shrubs where there's no flowering involved. Okay, gymnosperm usually mean the seed are naked, which means there's no compartment that encloses it. While angiosperm require production of flowers and also fruits that encloses the or have chambers within the seed itself. All right, so with seed plants, their sporophyte will produce spores that remain within the sporangia. Okay, and that's another thing that is different compared with the other two plant groups we talked about in the last chapter. Their spores don't need to be dispersed like non-vascular plants or seedless vascular plants do. And so seed plant spores will actually develop into tiny gametophytes while they're remaining inside of the sporangia. This actually ends up protecting the gametophytes from environmental stresses, which is what we talked about, in the beginning of the chapter, that, usually sporophyte have moist tissues, and that can protect gametophytes from UV radiation and also prevent gametophytes from drying out, which is why it was a nice thing that gametophytes are now embedded within the sporophyte such that um, they can be protected from those either drying out, or UV radiation. And then in addition, developing gametophytes can obtain nutrients from parental sporophytes, while free-living gametophytes of seedless vascular plants must depend on their own. They gotta fend on for themselves. Like I said, this gametophyte right here from seedless vascular plant, they're just laying there by themselves. They gotta fight on their own, make food on their own, etc. Survive on your own. Whereas your developing gametophyte within your seed plants, they can get nutrients directly from their parent sporophytes. That's why they remain attached. And then until they're ready for germination, then they start, and then they leave the tree, the plant itself. Okay. So in a sense, the gametophytes, like I said, was getting smaller and smaller as we go from non-vascular plants to seedless vascular plants to seed plants. Now, while most seedless plants are homosporous, which is we already mentioned in the last chapter, produce only one kind of spore, which develop into bisexual or requires a bisexual gametophyte that can produce both a sperm and the egg. And we can see that from the last chapter when we talked about the moss life cycle and the fern life cycle. Sea plants, on the other hand, are heterosporous, which they can produce two kinds of spores using two different parts of the plant. Um, you know, we have megasporangia inside these sea plants that comes from megasporophylls, which are really the large modified leaves. We talked about sporophylls being leaves that has these sporangia attached to it. So this is large leaves with these megasporangia attached to it. And within the megasporangia, there are cells that will produce megaspores, and megaspore will ultimately become your female gametophytes, which each of those will produce one megaspore. On the other side, you have microsporangia, which it comes from microsporophylls, usually smaller modified leaves, and they will produce microspores, which will ultimately become your male gametophytes. And each of those male gametophyte can actually produce many microspores, which kind of again analogous with humans, because I keep going back to humans because we are humans, and I teach anatomy and physiology mainly. So this is why I keep going back to humans. But with humans, you have one egg that is ovulated each month, whereas sperm is produced in massive amounts each time. So this is kind of similar and analogous to that. Sea plants are, actually retain your megasporangium within the plant parent sporophyte, where a layer of sporophyte tissue called integuments actually surrounds that megasporangium. So this is like the macroscopic view of, let's say, a pine cone. We've seen pine cone out there on the streets, and you maybe have collected them before. So well, usually you will see these pine cones have these blades or scale-like thing being attached to it, and that's what we're talking about as your megasporophyll. Okay, now those are large scale leaves that will have embedded in there. There will be these yellow little circles, and if we enlarge those yellow oval objects, you will see that there is a layer of integument that surrounds the egg, okay, the megaspore, and then the megaspore, which will then ultimately become your egg cell. And again, with humans, we call one of our skin as our integumentary system. So again, going back to the same word of integument, meaning a layer that surrounds the the megaspore and megaspore. Okay, so it's just the outer layer that protects the megasporangium, just like how our human skin protects our body. So gymnosperm, which are those that have naked seeds, have megasporangia that is only surrounded by one layer of integument, while angiosperm are surrounded by two layers of integument. Megasporangium and hence the megasporangium, which is right here, and the megaspore plus the integument is what adds up to what we call a structure called ovule. Okay, so this whole thing right here is an ovule. So within the ovule, the megaspore will become your female gametophyte, which can actually generate one or more eggs. We'll talk more detail about that process when we actually get to the gymnosperm. So that was the story of the megaspore and the ovule. What about for the microspores? Microspores develop into pollen grain, which consists of your male gametophyte enclosed within a pollen wall. Okay, so don't be confused where you think pollen grain is the sperm itself. No, okay, pollen grain actually consists of the male gametophyte. And then the male gametophyte will produce the sperm within when the pollen grain gets to your female parts, which is your megaspore. So this is how pollen grain is different from your megaspore or egg cell. And we have already mentioned this from the last chapter that sporopollenin is a pollen wall that protects pollen grain as it is being dispersed by wind or animal. And this is just some these are just some examples of the type of pollen you can have. They come in all different shapes and sizes, but usually, many times they are microscopic, very tiny. You might see them as a layer of green or yellowish color on your car in the spring sometimes, on your car surfaces in the spring sometimes. And they sometimes have protrusions like this or flat like that, depending on what is their purpose for and what is their pollination method. We'll talk more about the pollination method later. So sea plants, no longer need water to transfer sperm like non-vascular or seedless vascular plants need to, because we notice that now pollen grain only need wind or hitchhiking a ride on an animal to have a way to reach the ovule. So that's why sea plants don't even need water anymore for the swim. You know how we said the sperm will swim through the water in your non-vascular plants and seedless vascular plants. But now you don't need that. Okay, since we don't need these moisture around, we don't need moist habitats. This is, in a sense, what allows for the first colonization of plants on dry habitats. Because for mosses and ferns, they like moist habitats. Even if their spores was to reach a dry habitat, it is very unlikely or have very low chances of them surviving and growing and thriving. So now that we have these pollen grains and seeds, we can allow for that dry habitat colonization. Now, before fertilization can happen, the pollen grain must reach the part of the plant containing the ovule, and that process itself is called pollinization. So that's why pollinization must happen before fertilization. And once pollen grain does that, it will germinate. Germinate means it will begin growing. And once it begins growing, it will also grow a pollen tube. Okay. And pollen tube is what discharges sperm into the female gametophyte within the ovule. And you can see that, where we have this ovule right here. Here's that pollen tube because pollen grain has pollinated the ovule, and pollen tube is what allows, it kind of creates a little hollow tube that allows sperm to go into the megaspore or the egg itself. And once pollen grain does that, it will germinate. Okay. Now, notice that there is no requirement for sperm to swim through water like we talked about before in the moss life cycle or the fern life cycle. It is the pollen tube that carries sperm to the ovule, which diminish or, kind of weed out the need for some sperm to have a flagella. So actually, most gymnosperms and all angiosperms don't even have flagellated sperm anymore because you don't need to. You don't need it. Kind of like going with that natural selection theory where we said that whatever's trait is best advantage for survival and reproduction will be preserved. Those that are not will be sort of selected off. Okay, in this case, flagellated sperm is no longer needed, so they are selected off from the system. And so once sperm reaches the egg, fertilization then happens. So you can see the difference between pollination, I keep calling it pollinization, pollination and fertilization. Pollination is the action of pollen grain going towards your ovule, germinate and begin making that pollen tube, making the sperm. Okay, so that's why pollination has to happen before the fact that you have fertilization. Okay, fertilization means now the sperm is inside the egg. It fertilizes it, which then forms a zygote. That zygote will become a sporophyte embryo, and the ovule develops into a seed once that sporophyte embryo starts to grow. Now, within the seed, there's also food supply that allows for enrichment and giving nutrients to the embryo as it grows. And also, there is a protective coat called the seed coat that is derived from the original integument that we talked about earlier. So they say that seeds represent a major evolutionary innovation that contributed to the opening of new ways of life for seed plants. So why is seed an evolutionary adaptation that is more advantageous compared to spores? Because that's a new thing with seed plants. Why are they better compared to spores that were present in non-vascular and seedless vascular plants? Well, first of all, seeds actually provide protection from a lot of harsh environments. So seeds are multicellular. okay, which is an embryo that is protected by a layer of tissues, while spores are single cells, so they're more prone to dying or actually be, damaged by any environmental changes, etc. Second, seeds can actually remain dormant for days, months, or sometimes even years. And it gets crazy where sometimes seeds are still good after thousands of years. An example of that where seeds from date palm trees, which is has a scientific name Phoenix dactylifera, were discovered under rubble of a 2,000-year-old fortress near the Dead Sea. So when scientists discovered these bunch of seeds, they were like, well, why don't we try to plant them and see what happens? So they planted the seeds. The seeds actually germinated, and seedlings actually grew into a plant like this. So this tree was alive 2,000 years ago, formed seeds. Those seeds got trapped underneath this rubble of concrete, and 2,000 years later were discovered by scientists where thankfully they didn't throw them away, and they said, oh, and they tried to grow it and it grew. So that's crazy. Seeds can remain dormant for thousands of years, of course much older than you and I, many generations later. Then you can still have this seed that can become a viable plant. That is crazy, which is awesome. And lastly, seeds have a supply of stored food. So for seed plants, usually when they drop seeds, especially the heavier seeds or fruits, they land close. They usually end up landing close to the parent sporophyte plant. So how, seeds can travel farther away is usually by wind, if they're light enough, or by animals, if the animals end up eating the seeds, or the seeds end up clinging on to the animal and they just hitch a ride with the animal. Those are the methods where seeds can be carried very long distance. We're talking about hundreds of kilometers. Now, why can't spores do that back then with non-vascular plants is that spores can't last that long. Okay. It is seeds that have the ability and of all these stored food supply within the seed itself that allows for them to travel long distances for a much longer time. So this stored food is what provides that critical support for the plant's growth when it does land on a suitable, favorable area and germinate into becoming a seedling. And hopefully that seedling will then become a mature plant. So, going back to the whole dormancy thing, when I thought about the dormancy part about, seeds, there kind of reminds me of kind of like hibernation of animals, I guess. And it also reminded me of corms that I harvest from my own plants, like caladiums and alocasia plants. These plants are actually seasonal, so they will not survive through the winter. But they do form these little seed-like structures called corms, and we can actually put away those corms once we collect them from the soil and keep them in a dry environment, and it actually can save them for planting the following spring season, which is pretty cool. That little corm will just grow into and sprout and grow into a whole new plant the next following spring season. But note that corms are not seeds. They're more like enlarged underground stems that store nutrients for plants during the dormancy. It's like the plant is going dormant, not the seeds. So, like I said, it's kind of like the hibernation of animals going through winter, allow it for it to sprout again in the spring. Since they can't survive through the winter anyway, might as well save all that energy and be dormant until spring arrives. So even though corms can be stored for away in a dry environment, they can only be stored for months. Where after months they go bad and they might not become a very healthy plant again. So Seeds, on the other hand, are the only kind that can last for years, in this case, thousands of years. So, but that's the one I thought about. Huh, that's really cool how plants have different ways to, adjust to their or adapt to their environment such that they will always prevail and survive because they know how important its role is in our biodiversity, which we'll talk about in the last part of the lecture. And with that, we are ready to hop in and talk about the first group of sea plants called the gymnosperms. So gymnosperms are what I like I mentioned before, are naked seeds that are exposed on the sporophylls that usually form cones shape structures. Okay, so that's why they are you'll see these pine cones on uh, pine trees because of the fact that those are the seeds. So most gymnosperms are cone-bearing plants called conifers. And conifers, like, we talk about specific plants that fall under that category, are pine tree, like I was saying, firs and redwoods. Now, pine tree is a sporophyte itself, while sporangia are located on the cones. So remember that sporophyte are the big tree now. Okay, not just the leaves like we saw in ferns, but now we have the tree, a whole tree, the bark part, the stem part of the tree, the bark. Okay, and then you have the leaves, etc., and then you have seeds that are on cones, which now you can see why gymnosperms is starting to become more complex compared to non-vascular plants. Now, conifers are heterosporous, which means they actually produce two separate things, one for egg, one for production of sperm, and they actually do it through two different cones. One type of cone is called pollen cone, which is usually smaller in size when you compare the two together, and the scales of the cones are made up of microsporophylls. So you can see that right here in this picture is a pollen cone. And when you look at, sort of pluck them off the tree, they are very small in size when, compared to the other one. And then the leaves are also very small on there. That's why they're made up of what's called the microsporophylls. And within each of those microsporophylls is a bunch of microsporangia. Again, that will become your ultimate sperm or pollen and then sperm. Um, so if you were to go out into a pine tree area, pine tree forest area, they say that yellow pollen, usually these pollen grains end up being yellow. If you shake that tree, a whole dust and gust of yellow pollen actually falls down on you. So if you have allergies to tree pollen, don't do that. And my son actually have ridden on a horse and horse ride before with, as a whole family, and then his head hit one of the branches. Pollen fell all over him. His eyes swelled up because he has really bad pollen allergies. So his eye was so swollen, I felt like his eye was gonna pop out of his socket. It looked so scary. So just be careful with trees. Don't shake them if you have any type of allergies or people around you have any type of allergies. I know some kids think it's fun to do because you see, oh, shake it, and you have all these dust going around, but it can be dangerous if you are allergic to them. So within the microsporangia, there are cells that are called microsporocytes. And in anatomy and physiology, I always say that the suffix "cytes" always means cells. So that's why, by the fact that it says microsporal cytes, these are cytes that reside in the microsporangia. And it is these cells that undergo meiosis. Remember, that is meiosis, not mitosis, that makes your haploid microspores. And then these microspores will then become your pollen grain that contain your male gametophytes. And the male gametophyte are the ones that just going to end up making sperm cells. Second type of cone that is, generated by these conifers are called the ovulate cones, which are much larger in size. If you look at this picture here, the scales are compound structure, so they look a little bit more complex than pollen cones. They have megasporophylls. which bears your megasporangia, as well as some modified stem tissue. Then that's something different from pollen cones. That's why they're bigger. Now, within the megasporangia, you have megasporocytes, just like how you have microsporocytes, which are cells then that will undergo meiosis again to generate your haploid megaspores inside the ovule. And then, well, I'll talk about, where exactly the ovule is within the plant, especially if when we get to the angiosperm. But ovule then will become your female gametophyte, which will ultimately make your egg cell, okay, produce your egg cell. So the female gametophyte again is retained within the sporangia. They don't need to come out or be tossed and dispersed somewhere else. It will be retained within the sporangia itself. Um, and hence, when you look at pine cones outside, notice that they're on the floor. There may be small ones that look like that, or there may be bigger ones that look like that. And usually, people like to collect these bigger ones because they look nicer with all the layers and all the complex structures within it. But know that whatever you picked up from the outside, that's actually an ovulate cone of the pine tree. Now, in general, it takes actually 3 years for male and female gametophytes to be produced because the way we've been talking about it sounds like, oh, okay, it's easy. There's this step, goes this step, goes to that step. But for the tree itself, it takes 3 years for those gametophytes to be produced. And then they will fertilize into seeds because from the gametophytes, they will make egg cells, sperm cells. Sperm still have to fertilize the egg, and once the egg is fertilized, it will become a seed. And this with this 3 years, we're talking about from the time we start to see these two cones appear on the tree, because of course a very young pine tree will not have these cones. And so from the point that you start to see these cones on the tree, it's 3 years from then that's when those male and female gametophytes are ready. And then once reaches maturity, the scales, are these little lines, or leaves, you can make a sporophylls. These scales of the ovulate cone will separate, and so that they can disperse the seeds by wind, which is, and once the seeds get to a likely favorable area where they can grow and have water and access to sunlight, the pine seedling will form, eventually become a new pine tree. And that's how gymnosperm are able to reproduce. And with that, here is the pine life cycle. With the pine life cycle, it's a little different compared to your moss and your fern life cycle, but overall, you still have those different stages of gametophyte, sporophyte, seed. Now you have add to it seeds, etc. So let's go through this. The first step of the pine life cycle is conifer species have to have both ovulate cones and pollen cones on the tree, just like we said earlier. So here's that ovulate cone containing your female gametophyte, and then your pollen cone that contains your male gametophyte. And within your pollen cone, your microsporophyte will go through meiosis to produce your haploid microspores. So that's why these microspores right here have microspores right here have become haploids, which is your pollen grain that will enclose your male gametophyte. Third step, your ovule or ovulate cone will then have will actually make two ovules per scale, which means for every one of these leafy things you're seeing on the ovulate cone, you will have two ovules in there. And within the ovule, each of them contain one megasporium. So this is how they look like with the megasporium. Inside there's a sporocyte. This is, kind of signifying that little leafy part I showed you earlier, that leafy part enlarged, and we're looking into that part within the leaf. And fourth step is where pollination occurs and pollen grain will reach your ovule. It will then germinate and forms that pollen tube. So here's megaspore, which is your egg cell, and then pollen grain will actually go into there. That's the whole process of pollination. I don't know why they didn't put like pollination right here. I'll put that in there. Pollination. And then once your that pollen grain sits there, it will start to make what's called the pollen tube. Okay, so the remnants or starting parts of the pollen tube is right there. And once megasporocyte go through meiosis, it actually makes 4 haploid cells, which is why you see 4 looking cells inside this megaspore, but only one survives as a megaspore. But so you might be like, oh, why do you make 4 haploid cells and only one survives? I guess that's all part of the process of making more, having more offspring than the environment can handle, and then pick one that is the best, that will survive best, which means it will survive best in the out there in the external environment as well. And kind of like that's what happens again in humans too, where female ovaries actually have, when we ovulate, multiple eggs will mature because inside each ovary there's many, like thousands, okay, hundreds of thousands of eggs. And in there, each month we only ovulate one egg. But multiple egg actually matures each month, but only one actually makes it through and ruptures and be ovulated. So I would think that's kind of similar here, where you have 4 haploid cells forming within the megaspore, but only one will survive to become that one egg. And then step 6, megaspores will then develop into a female gametophyte, which will then form your egg. Okay, so this is why you have your egg right here. And if it meets the sperm in step 7, first of all, eggs will mature, and then now sperm cells will develop within the pollen tube. So that's why I said pollen grains, having pollinated your ovule, is what needs to happen first before any fertilization can happen, or else the sperm is not going to go anywhere. The sperm needs to get to the egg through the pollen tube, which is only will start growing after pollination. So once the sperm can access the egg, it will fertilize it, and actually that pollen tube will extend into the female gametophyte, and that's how fertilization can then happen. Fertilization, and then you will form your new sporophyte, which is the embryonic version of it, which will form your seed. That seed will then go on to become your seedling. So usually this fertilization step takes more than 1 year after pollination, and I've talked about earlier where some pine trees can take 3 years for this to happen. So even if all eggs are fertilized, usually only one zygote develops into an embryo, and that ovule will then become a seed. And then if the seed falls onto suitable soil and grounds exposure to sunlight, they will become germinate and become a seedling. Ultimately, the whole new plant again, the whole new tree again for many, many years. So before I move on, I want to show you this video, which kind of gives you a glimpse of how this all looks like in the wild itself. Since again, we're not in an in-person lab, we can actually then look at how these pine cones and this, ovulate cones and pollen cone looks like.
During the spring months, you might have noticed these orange clusters looking a bit like catkins appearing on conifers like pines, spruces, and firs. And if you passed by conifers during windy weather, you might have even seen a cloud of yellow dust blowing from these orange clusters. The yellow dust is actually pollen, which comes out of male pollen cones that develop on coniferous trees.
Sometimes you see it on
They're
your
present
car.
only for a short time, so you won't be able to see them on the trees all year round. But how can there be pollen when there aren't any flowers? Coniferous trees belong to a group of plants called Gymnosperms. Their reproduction is evolutionarily more basic than reproduction in angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. To see what we mean by this, let's look at this process in pine trees. During spring, Pine trees start producing male cones at the tips of the
That's something I
branches.
won't do.
They appear in clusters, and each cone is loaded with pollen. Every individual pollen grain can produce male reproductive cells called sperm. Pines are not pollinated by insects or birds, as you might be used to from flowering plants. Instead, the pollen is released from male cones and carried away by wind. Each pollen grain is equipped with 2 air sacs to help it float in the air, which makes them look like Mickey Mouse's head. The pollen grain is very tiny, only about 1/20th of a millimeter in length, so you would need a high magnification microscope to see it.
Transmission electron microscope.
If you happen to find pollen cones and can reach them, try shaking the branch they're on and witness the amazing pollen explosion.
I won't do that.
If there's not much coming out, it might be because the cones are older and they've already released all their pollen. Of course, if you're allergic to plant pollen, this is not a good experiment to try. But let's get back to reproduction. Now we have pollen with male cells floating in the air, but in order to make a seed, pollen needs to find its way to the female reproductive structures. Where are these located? In pines, you'll find the female cones on the same tree where you find the male cones. These female cones look much more like what you imagine when you think of a pine cone. However, at the time when they're receiving pollen, they're much smaller and more closed up. Inside these nearly completely enclosed cones are structures called ovules, which are ready to receive pollen. Pollen drifting through the air randomly finds its way inside the female cone through small openings. After the pollen is received, the female cone closes completely, while the sperm produced by the pollen joins with the ovule. This is called fertilization, and it will result in a seed. The cone stays closed to protect the new seed inside during its development, a process that takes 2 to 3 years. During this time, the cone grows in size, but stays firmly closed. You might notice female cones of different ages all on the same tree. When the seeds inside are fully mature, the cone opens up to release the seeds. They can be dispersed by wind or animals like birds or squirrels who enjoy eating them, but may drop a few in the process. And there's one more cool thing that pine cones do. Female cones open only when the weather is convenient for seed dispersal. During wet, rainy weather, female cones close up to protect the seeds inside. You've probably seen this while walking outside after a rain.
You should take a look
All the
next
pine
time.
cones are closed, but once they dry out, they open up again.
Which is pretty cool.
You can try this experiment at home. Just take an open, mature female cone and place it into a bowl filled with water. Watch the scales slowly close up as the cone takes on the moisture. That's the protecting mechanism in action. Let us know in the comments below if you try this experiment, and we'll see you in the next.
Okay, so that was a really good kind of like actual looking at the cones, other than those cartoon drawings we see in the biology from the textbook previously. All right. So out of the 10 plant phyla we have, 4 are actually gymnosperm. We talked about how out of all the plants, we have 10 that are still living today, 10 phyla of plants that are still living today. So 4 of those are your gymnosperms, which is your Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, Netophyta, and Codiferophyta. I know they're a mouthful. So Cycadophyta is or the common name cycads are large cones, usually that looks like this when you look at them from the outside, and they have palm-like leaves that makes up 350 living species today. And unlike most seed plants, cycads have flagellated sperm, which tells us that this is actually a descendant from seedless a descent from seedless vascular plants. Most endangered of all plant groups usually is these Psychedophyta, and they found that 75% of their species are actually threatened by habitat destruction and other human actions. We'll talk about, how the humans and increase of our human population size have impacted our ecosystem, including killing a lot of these, plant species off. Second group or second phyla of gymnosperm is the Ginkgophyta, which is commonly called ginkgos. And sadly, only one species of these guys remain in this phylum. So this particular species is called Ginkgo biloba, okay? Ginkgo biloba, which also is commonly named, called maiden hair tree. And this is actually one of my favorite trees, and I actually have one of these in my backyard. They're usually deciduous, which means they will shed their leaves annually, completely bare in the winter, and then when the spring comes again, they will grow again. So their leaves is what attracts me and thinks that they are beautiful, is because they are these green fan-like leaves. Then they actually turn this beautiful gold color in autumn. Sometimes it's sad to see autumn, all the leaves, all the trees are bare. But with these, yes, it's sad to see the leaves dropping, but at the same time, that transition from that pretty green to this beautiful gold color is really amazing to see. So these ginkgos also have flagellated sperm, just like your Psychodophyta, and usually only pollen-producing trees are planted in the cities and homes. You will see this outside a lot, but only pollen-producing one, which is what they call the male ginkgo trees, are planted because the fleshy seeds from female ginkgo trees actually smells terrible. Okay, and these seeds will just drop on the ground outside in the cities, and as they rot and decay in the weather, they will smell really bad. So that's why usually only male ginkgo trees are planted for by human means. Of course, in the wild, they will exist as both male and female, and also we have to have female trees in order to keep producing more of these ginkgo trees around. Third phyla is your nettle phyla, which includes actually three genus of species. You have Welwitschia, okay, which is only one species is alive today still, Welwitschia mirabilis, and they can actually live thousands of years and only found in the deserts of southwestern Africa. They have these really huge strap-like leaves, is one of the world's largest leaves, by the way, and they kind of look like this in the middle of the desert. The second genus is called a Netum, which is right here, and they have 35 species or so of tropical trees, shrubs, and vines, which usually are native to Africa and Asia. Their leaves look more similar to flowering plants, and their seeds actually kind of look like fruits, which on the outside they look like probably angiosperm, but they're actually gymnosperm. And how they categorize these phyla into gymnosperm is the fact that they are molecularly very similar, okay, which we talked about the molecular homology part in the last chapter. Okay, if Ephedra, which is right here, Ephedra has 40 species of desert shrubs worldwide, and they produce a very interesting compound called ephedrine, which is a medicine, which is used in medicine as a decongestion. So we'll talk about at the end of the chapter how a lot of the plants out there nowadays is we actually gather chemical compounds from them to make derivatives of prescription drugs for treating a whole series of disease. So plants are really important in that way too. They're good for making medicines. And the last gymnosperm phyla is called a Coniferophyta. Even though they're mentioned last, they're actually the largest phyla of the four in the as part of the gymnosperm species. They actually have 600 species of conifers out there. So they're usually very large trees, and their leaves are kind of like needles, kind of shaped like needles, and then some are actually scale like leaves, And most of them are usually evergreens. Evergreen meaning that they don't drop leaves. That's why they're not called deciduous. Their leaves stay around, keep on the tree all year long, even though when you go out in the winter, like, Colorado or something, it's all snow and white, but you still see these beautiful dark green trees, pine trees that are evergreens that still give you some, taste of the plants, even though it's winter time when a lot of plants have dropped their leaves. So that's just something interesting about your coniferal phyta. Of course, it's seen all over the world, depending, all species are all over. There's some that lives in the northern hemisphere, and there's some that live in the southern hemisphere. So some examples, a few of them, we can't mention all 600 of them. So these are a good list of common species we see. First of those is Douglas fir, which is these guys right here. They actually provide timber for our timber industry. And what those wood is good for is for construction of houses, for production of paper, and also for production of crates. So anything that require wood, your Douglas fir is what we go to for our timber industry. And then you have your European larch species right here, which is extremely cold tolerant. That's something interesting. Okay, we already said that these conifers tend to be evergreens, but this is one that is really extreme where it can survive up to -50 Celsius. Okay, that's not Fahrenheit. This is -50 degrees Celsius, and everything's supposed to freeze at 0 degrees Celsius. So imagine -50 degrees Celsius, but they somehow still can survive. And then you have sequoia. Sequoia is a very famous one that you have heard of before because there is national park where there's many of these sequoia trees. They are one of the largest and also oldest living organisms. Many of those trees over there have lived for thousands of years, and that's why they're so big. And usually you find them in the California side. And then you have common juniper, which is these guys right here. And what's special about these conifers is that they produce fleshy cones. That's why you see little fruits like that on their branches. Fleshy for seeds or fruits in terms of plants always means that it is fruits that is generated. And the seed is kind of embedded within all the fleshy parts of the fruits. And then you have Wallaby pine, which is, used to be only known as existent from fossils. We didn't know that they're actually living on our Earth, still living today. We found them in fossils, and we thought that they have been extinct after that. But they have found a few species, about 40 of those species from Australia, and through propagation techniques, now they are all over the world and once again populating the Earth. And last but not least, you have bristlecone pine, also very cool tree that usually lives in the desert area and is found to be 5,000 years old. Okay, so again, is one of those oldest living trees around, type of trees around that can live for that long. All right, so it is around 57 minutes. I will conclude part one here and continue when we get to part two.